In this presentation, I'll be talking about how much lobbying a 501c3 organization can do. You probably already know that 501c3 public charities can lobby. Federal tax law, which sets out the rules for tax-exempt organizations like 501c3s, tells us that 501c3 public charities can lobby within certain annual limits. The question for C3s then is, what are those limits? 501c3 public charities, which is what many nonprofits are, have the option to calculate their lobbying using one of two choices, the 501h expenditure test or the insubstantial part test. A 501c3 charity will be under one or the other, never both. For almost all C3 charities, we think that the 501h expenditure test is the better option for a number of reasons. I'm going to lay out those reasons and then talk about the alternative way for a 501c3 charity to measure its lobbying, the insubstantial part test. The publication you see on the right of the screen, called Worry-Free Lobbying for Nonprofits, is available for free on our website, and it lays out these reasons in greater detail. I'm going to start out by talking about the 501h expenditure test, since, as I just mentioned, this is the option we recommend for most 501c3 public charities. That number 501h comes right out of the federal tax code, and a 501c3 organization choosing the 501h expenditure test remains a 501c3 organization, just one that determines its lobbying limit under that 501h expenditure test. Under the 501h expenditure test, a 501c3 charity gets clear dollar-based limits to determine how much they can lobby. Those limits are calculated based on a simple formula. The next important point about the 501h expenditure test is that only what the C3 actually spends on lobbying counts toward the organization's annual lobbying limit. That means that low-cost lobbying communications can have a big impact. You can spend very little to get a lobbying message to a large audience, for example by email, and all that counts toward your organization's lobbying limit for that message is how much you actually spent on the communication. So that would be some staff time and some portion of your email costs. Additionally, under the 501h expenditure test, a 501c3 gets clear definitions of direct and grassroots lobbying. So you know, as an employee of a 501c3, when you're actually making a lobbying communication, which would count toward your lobbying limit, versus a non-lobbying advocacy communication, which does not count toward your annual lobbying limit. The penalty for a 501c3 going over its annual lobbying limit is that it has to pay a tax on the excess lobbying amount. A 501c3 is only at risk of losing its C3 status if it goes over its lobbying limit by quite a lot over a 4-year period. In order to get these benefits of the clear dollar-based lobbying limits, the definitions of lobbying, a 501c3 will have to fill out a very simple one-page form called Form 5768, and it has to send it into the IRS. The C3 only has to fill out this form one time, and the 501h expenditure test stays in effect until the C3 revokes it using that same form. As I mentioned, that publication you see on the right of the screen, Worry-Free Lobbying for Nonprofits, is available on our website, and it has a lot more information, including all of the facts I just talked about that make the 501h expenditure test a really good option for 501c3s. You can look for it on our website, which is www.afj.org. If a 501c3 does not fill out that simple Form 5768, that one-page form, to say it wants to measure its lobbying under the 501h expenditure test, that C3 will by default be under what we call the insubstantial part test. Under this test, the IRS tells C3s that lobbying must be an insubstantial part of their overall activities, but the IRS doesn't actually define what it means by insubstantial. It doesn't actually tell C3s how much lobbying they can do. So under this test, we don't really know what a C3's lobbying limit is. Some people who advise C3s suggest that lobbying should be limited to 5% or less of the organization's overall activities. Beyond the fact that there are not clear lobbying limits under this test, lobbying is not defined under the insubstantial part test, unlike under the 501h expenditure test, which provides clear definitions of direct and grassroots lobbying. Also under the insubstantial part test, the IRS looks at all of a C3's lobbying activities, not just what it spends on lobbying, to determine whether the C3 did more than an insubstantial amount of lobbying. Unlike under the 501H expenditure test, where all the IRS cares about is how much did the C3 actually spend on lobbying. And finally, the penalty for doing more than an insubstantial amount of lobbying is potentially more serious under the insubstantial part test. Doing too much lobbying could theoretically result in the loss of tax-exempt status for a 501c3 organization. For all of these reasons, we think that most C3 charities will benefit greatly from choosing to measure their lobbying under the 501H expenditure test rather than the insubstantial part test. But to do so, you do have to proactively fill out that form and send it in to the IRS. For more questions about this or other legal advocacy issues, I encourage you to contact us for free technical assistance, and our contact information for our free technical assistance service is there on the bottom of the screen. We have an email address, advocacy@afj.org, and a toll-free number, 866-675-6229. If you use either one of those ways to get a hold of us, you will be directed to our on-call attorney and we will be able to answer your questions. We also have a lot of information available on our website.